For 133 days, one man drifted alone across the Atlantic on a wooden raft barely bigger than a door. When a fishing boat finally found him 9 miles off the coast of Brazil, he was too weak to stand. But he was alive, and he was the only one. No one has ever survived longer, lost at sea. Not before him, and not in all the years since. He was no soldier, no survival expert. He served meals on a cargo ship, and he could barely swim. And with his food and water long gone, he did one thing so extreme that the men who pulled him from the sea refused to believe it. His name was Poon Lim. He was born in 1918 in a small village on Hainan Island off the southern coast of China. His family were poor. His father travelled town to town teaching martial arts. His older brothers worked the factories and sent money home so that Poon, the youngest, could go to school. But the world he grew up in was closing in. Japan was pushing into China, town by town, and every young man was one order away from being marched to the front. So in 1936, his father made a hard choice. Rather than lose his son to the war, he sent him away, to Hong Kong, to learn a trade and disappear onto the sea. Poon trained as a sailor and signed on with a British merchant ship. He was 18 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was free. But freedom for a Chinese sailor under a British flag had a low ceiling. They got the hardest jobs and the lowest pay. Poon would say later that the mark of a good ship was a simple one, that the officers did not beat you. He walked away from it. He went back to Hong Kong and trained as a mechanic, a young man with careful, clever hands who could take a broken thing apart and make it work again. Remember that. By 1941, word went round that the merchant navy was finally paying a decent wage. Poon needed the money. So he went back, to the sea he had every reason to hate. In the spring of 1942, he became second steward aboard a British cargo ship, the Benlomond. She was slow, she was barely armed, and she was crossing the South Atlantic, completely alone. In the middle of a world war, a single ship with no escort was exactly what German submarines were hunting for. It began just after 2 in the afternoon, on the 23rd of November, 250 miles off the coast of Brazil. 2 torpedoes tore into her hull. In about 2 minutes, the Benlomond was gone. Of the 53 men aboard, 52 went down with her. Only 1 did not. Poon grabbed a life jacket, threw himself into the water, and kicked away as the sea pulled the ship down behind him. He surfaced in a slick of oil and wreckage, a sailor who could barely swim, alone on the widest ocean on Earth. For 2 hours he clung to the life jacket, waiting to drown. And then, rising on the swell, a small wooden raft, empty, drifting toward him, like an answer. He dragged himself aboard, and because he could not swim, the first thing Poon Lim did was tie a rope from the raft to his own wrist, so that if he slipped off in his sleep, the ocean could not simply take him. Then he took stock. A few tins of biscuits and pemmican, a little chocolate and sugar, and around 10 gallons of fresh water. Enough, if he was careful, for maybe 7 weeks. But Poon Lim did not plan for 7 weeks. From the very first hour, somehow, he was already planning for 100 days. And that decision, not the biscuits, not the water, is what kept him alive. Because out there, the ocean was not his hardest enemy. The mind was. Alone, with nothing but water in every direction, most men come apart long before their bodies fail. Poon decided, early, that he would not be one of them. He solved water first. He stripped the canvas cover off his life jacket and stretched it across the raft's poles, part sunshade, part rain catcher, and when the squalls came, he funneled every drop into an empty tin. To hold on to time, he tied a knot in a rope for every day that passed, and when the rope ran out of length, he began instead to count the full moons. The sea was not always merciful. Storms came out of nowhere and turned the raft into a wild thing, black water breaking clean over the boards. Every time, the rope on his wrist was the only reason the ocean did not carry him off into the dark. Around day 55, the food ran out. 2 weeks after that, so did the water. For almost anyone else, that is where the story ends. For Poon Lim, it was closer to the beginning. And this is where those clever mechanic's hands finally paid off. He pried the small spring out of his flashlight and bent it into a fishhook. He unraveled a rope, strand by strand, into a fishing line. He crushed his last biscuit into bait. His first catch he ate raw. His second he used to land something bigger. Just like that, a starving man was feeding himself from an empty ocean. When the little hook bent, he dug an iron nail out of the raft's own boards and made a stronger one. When he needed a blade, he beat a tin can flat until it held an edge. He was building a survival kit out of the raft he was floating on, and when the seabirds came to rest on the raft, he caught them with his bare hands and dried the meat in the sun into strips of jerky, a store for the days the fish would not bite. By now, Poon Lim had beaten the ocean at every turn, but the thing he is remembered for, the part people simply refuse to believe, began the day a much larger animal arrived. By his own account, a shark began to circle the raft. Weak, thirsty, half-starved, Poon did not paddle away from it. He decided instead to catch it. He baited a heavy line with the remains of a bird and wrapped his hands in canvas so it would not cut him to the bone. When the shark took the bait, he fought it, a starving man against a predator on a raft the size of a mattress. He beat it with his heavy water tin until at last it went still. There was no fresh water left, so he did the only thing that would keep him alive. He cut the shark open and he drank the fluid from its liver. It is the detail his rescuers found hardest to believe. It is also exactly the kind of thing you only know if you have been that close to dying of thirst. After that, the days ran together. The sun blistered his skin raw. Salt opened sores that would not heal. He lost 20 pounds off a frame that had none to spare, until there came a point when he could no longer stand. He talked to himself, just to keep a human voice in the air. He watched the sky change colour and named the days he could no longer count. And still, every single morning, he chose to stay alive one more day. And then the world came looking and looked straight through him. A cargo ship appeared on the horizon and steamed close. The crew came out on deck. They saw him, and they did not stop. Poon believed he knew why. A lone Asian man on a raft in enemy waters, he was sure they took him for a stranded Japanese sailor and left him to die. The truth was crueler and no kinder to him. German submarines would plant a fake survivor on a raft to lure rescue ships into torpedo range, so merchant ships were forbidden to stop, for anyone. The men who looked at Poon Lim and sailed on may only have been following orders. Days later, an aircraft found him and dropped a marker buoy in the water, a promise that someone would come back. Then a storm swept in and washed the buoy away. That was the lowest moment of all. Not the shark, not the thirst. It was being seen and left, understanding that whatever happened next, he would have to do it himself. And then, after more than 4 months alone, the water itself began to change. Blue turned to brown, muddy. It was river silt, the outflow of the Amazon, bleeding hundreds of miles out to sea. After all this time, land was finally close. On the 5th of April, 1943, 3 Brazilian fishermen spotted a small dark shape riding the swell, about 9 miles from shore. On that raft was a man too weak to lift his own arms. 133 days had passed since his ship went down. They lifted him gently into their boat and carried him ashore. He had drifted close to 750 miles. He had lost the strength to walk, and within days he had it back. He had survived longer alone at sea than any human being before him. And in more than 80 years since, no one has ever broken his record. King George VI gave him the British Empire Medal. The Royal Navy studied what he had done and wrote his methods into their survival manuals. The canopy, the flashlight hook, the sun-dried jerky, taught to trained sailors who carried every tool he never had. And yet, for all of that, the world still could not quite see him. When Poon Lim tried to join the United States Navy, they turned him away, for flat feet. When he tried to become an American, a quota with almost no room for a Chinese man turned him away too. It took a United States senator and an act of Congress to carve out an exception for him. In 1952, 10 years after the ocean failed to kill him, Poon Lim finally became a citizen of the country he'd chosen. He settled in Brooklyn, married, raised 4 children, and went back to sea for a living. He died in 1991, an old man in his own bed. He was not the strongest man on that ship. He was not a soldier or a hero out of a story. He served meals. What he had was a single decision made in the first hour, to plan for 100 days and then to live them, one at a time. Asked once about his record, he said he hoped no one would ever have to break it. The sailor who could barely swim became the reason that countless others made it home. If this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting, right here.